Rollo the Walker, from Viking raider to Duke of Normandy. In the fading light of a summer evening in 911 AD, a giant of a man stood at the prow of his longship as it cut through the waters of the Seine. His men had whispered that no horse in Francia could bear his weight, earning him the name Rollo the Walker, though the Frankish nobles who watched his approach from their castle walls used far less flattering terms for this Norse warrior who had terrorized their coasts. Yet this mere pirate, too large to ride and too proud to bow, would soon orchestrate one of history's most remarkable transformations. From Viking raider to Christian duke, from pagan warlord to founding father of Normandy. The bloodline he established would not only reshape Francia, but would, within 5 generations, conquer England and alter the course of European history. This is not merely the story of a warrior who traded his sword for a crown. It is the tale of a man who straddled 2 worlds, the dying age of Viking power and the birth of medieval Europe. Through cunning, brutality, and an almost prophetic ability to spot opportunity in chaos, Rollo crafted a dynasty from the ashes of the world he had helped burn. His life reads like a Norse saga, yet its consequences echo through European culture to this day, from the streets of modern Paris to the great castles of Britain. This is the story of how a Norse giant who refused to kiss a king's foot ended up putting his descendants on the thrones of Europe. The rise of Rollo, a Norse legend. On a fjord-carved coast where the northern lights danced across winter skies, a child was born who would make kings tremble. The exact location of Rollo's birth remains as mysterious as the man himself. Norwegian sagas claim him as their own, while Danish chronicles insist he first drew breath on their shores. What we know with certainty is that he emerged from a world where power flowed from the blade of a sword and the prow of a ship. The son of a Norse chieftain, young Rollo grew in a land where boys became warriors before their beards grew full. His childhood home would have been a great wooden hall, its rafters blackened by smoke from the central hearth, its walls adorned with shields that gleamed in the firelight. Here, between raids and feasts, skalds recited ancient tales of gods and heroes, stories that would pale in comparison to the legend Rollo himself would become. By the time he reached manhood, Rollo had already outgrown the physical proportions of ordinary men. Contemporary accounts describe him as being of such massive size that no horse could carry him in battle, a dramatic detail that would later prove both curse and blessing. Yet it was not merely his stature that set him apart. While other young warriors were content with small raids along familiar coasts, Rollo's ambitions stretched far beyond the horizon. The first test of these ambitions came early. A local dispute, its details lost to time, but likely involving land or honor, forced Rollo to make a choice that would alter history. Submit to the authority of Harald Fairhair, the king who was unifying Norway under his crown, or seek his fortune across the sea. Rollo, never one to bow to other men's demands, chose exile. As he stood at the prow of his first longship, watching his homeland fade into the mists, he could not have known that this departure would be the first step toward founding a dynasty that would reshape Europe. Years later, when Rollo had become one of the most feared and respected leaders in the Norse world, a captured Frank asked him about his origins. Rollo's reported answer was characteristically blunt. "I am of noble birth, but I seek not my heritage here. I seek new lands and victories of my own making." It was a philosophy that would carry him from the fjords of his youth to the rich lands of Francia, where his true saga would begin to unfold. The rise of Rollo, the Viking. Death came at dawn. The monks of Lindisfarne barely had time to sound their warning bells before Rollo's warband crashed onto their shores. The young Viking, already towering above his companions, led the charge on foot, his legendary size making horseback riding impossible. This raid, one of his first recorded attacks, would establish a pattern that would make his name synonymous with both terror and tactical brilliance along the coasts of northern Europe. Unlike the berserkers who relied on fury alone, Rollo fought with calculated precision. He transformed the traditional Viking hit-and-run tactics into a more sophisticated form of warfare. His men learned to strike not just monasteries, but strategic points along rivers and coasts, establishing bases that could be defended and supplied. When cornered by larger forces, Rollo would split his army into smaller units, surrounding and confusing his opponents, a tactic that would later influence Norman military strategy for generations. The chronicles of the time paint a portrait of a commander who combined raw physical power with an uncanny gift for strategy. During a raid in Francia, upon finding his force outnumbered 3-1, Rollo ordered his men to dig trenches, fill them with sharpened stakes, and cover them with brush. The next morning, the Frisian cavalry charged into this deadly trap, their formations shattered before Rollo's counterattack even began. Stories of such victories spread rapidly through the Viking world, drawing ambitious warriors to his banner. But it was along the waterways where Rollo truly excelled. He mastered the art of using rivers as highways, pushing deeper into enemy territory than most Vikings dared. His longships would appear suddenly from the morning mist, strike with devastating force, and vanish before local forces could mount an effective response. One Frankish chronicle described him as the master of water and wind, who turns defeat into victory and makes kings into beggars. By his 30th year, Rollo had assembled a fleet of 60 ships and a reputation that caused coastal towns to surrender at the mere sight of his sails on the horizon. Yet, for all his success as a raider, a greater destiny awaited, one that would begin with an ambitious assault on one of the most heavily fortified cities in Western Europe. Paris beckoned, and Rollo the Walker was about to take his biggest stride yet. Rollo's transformative journey from exile to power. The year 876 marked a turning point in Rollo's saga. Cast out of Denmark by King Harald Bluetooth, for reasons that chroniclers gleefully debated but never settled, he transformed banishment into opportunity. Within months of his exile, he had assembled a fleet of outcasts, adventurers, and ambitious warriors drawn to his growing legend. These weren't mere raiders. They were the nucleus of what would become one of the most formidable military forces in Northern Europe. Scotland felt his presence first. Leading his fleet through treacherous waters, Rollo struck the coast with surgical precision. But unlike other Viking raiders who simply plundered and fled, he established patterns that revealed his larger ambitions. He built temporary bases, forged alliances with local chiefs, and studied the politics of the lands he raided. Each victory added not just to his wealth, but to his understanding of how kingdoms could be built and broken. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles paint a vivid picture of his growing influence. The great Northman who walks like a bear but thinks like a fox. In Frisia, he discovered how to turn rivals into allies, offering protection to those who paid tribute and swift destruction to those who refused. His reputation grew not just for violence, but for keeping his word, a trait rare among Vikings and invaluable in his future dealings with the Franks. But it was along the Seine that Rollo found his true calling. The river presented a perfect corridor of power, deep enough for his ships, lined with rich monasteries and towns, and leading straight to the heart of Francia. Here, he didn't just raid, he studied. He learned the language, observed Frankish military tactics, and began to understand their political weaknesses. While other Viking leaders saw only silver and slaves to be taken, Rollo saw something far more valuable, a kingdom waiting to be carved out of chaos. As autumn approached in 885, he made the decision that would alter the course of European history. Rather than returning north with his plunder, he anchored his fleet near the mouth of the Seine and began preparing for something unprecedented, a full-scale assault on Paris itself. The Viking who could not ride a horse was about to challenge the very heart of Frankish power in a siege that would become legendary. The epic siege of Paris, Viking ambitions and strategies. November 25th, 885. The people of Paris awoke to a sight that turned their blood to ice. 700 Viking ships stretched across the Seine as far as the eye could see, their dragon-headed prows emerging from the morning mist. At their center stood Rollo, his massive frame unmistakable as he directed the positioning of siege engines. This was no mere raid. It was the beginning of the most ambitious Viking assault ever mounted against a major European city. Paris in 885 was essentially an island fortress, with 2 bridges acting as its lifelines to the mainland. Rollo's first move demonstrated the tactical brilliance that set him apart from other Viking leaders. Rather than launching a frontal assault, he divided his forces into 3 groups. One targeted the bridges, another positioned siege engines on the riverbanks, while a third established a naval blockade. The city's defenders could only watch as their carefully planned defenses were systematically surrounded. Bishop Goslin, the city's defender, had expected traditional Viking tactics, wild charges and attempts to scale the walls. Instead, Rollo introduced innovations that shocked the Franks. His men constructed covered walkways to protect sappers attacking the bridge foundations. Siege towers, rarely used by Vikings, were built and rolled toward the walls. When conventional attacks failed, he ordered his men to fill boats with flammable materials, setting them aflame and launching them at the wooden bridges. The siege stretched through one of the harshest winters in memory. While other Viking leaders might have retreated, Rollo used the frozen river to his advantage. His men dragged their ships onto land, converting them into shelters and mobile fortifications. They foraged widely, denying supplies to would-be relieving forces. Paris was slowly being strangled, not by brute force, but by patient, methodical strategy. By spring, though the city still stood, Rollo had achieved something far more valuable than mere plunder. His conduct of the siege had demonstrated to the Frankish nobility that here was no ordinary Viking raider, but a commander of remarkable sophistication. When Charles the Fat finally arrived with a relief army, he chose to negotiate rather than fight, a decision that established a crucial precedent. The Vikings, and Rollo in particular, had to be dealt with as political equals, not mere pirates. In accepting a massive payment to lift the siege, Rollo gained not just treasure, but legitimacy. He had come to Paris as a raider, he left as a power broker in Frankish politics. The rise of Rollo, master of the Seine. The years following the siege of Paris revealed Rollo's true genius. While other Viking leaders celebrated their payoff and sought new targets, he transformed the Seine River Valley into his personal kingdom. Every bend in the river became a strategic strongpoint, every tributary a route for his raiders. He wasn't just occupying territory, he was building an infrastructure of power that would last centuries. From his base at Rouen, Rollo orchestrated a campaign that combined military might with political cunning. He introduced a system of river tolls that forced merchants to choose, pay for his protection or face destruction. Many chose to pay, and soon trade began flowing again under his guarantee of safe passage. The Viking warrior was learning to think like a ruler, understanding that sustainable wealth came not from plunder, but from commerce and agriculture. His treatment of the local population marked a radical departure from typical Viking practice. Farmers who submitted to his authority were protected, their fields untouched. Monasteries that paid tribute found themselves defended against other raiders. Local nobles who opposed him vanished. Those who cooperated found themselves enriched. A new order was emerging along the Seine, one that blended Viking strength with Frankish administration. The Frankish response to this development was paralyzed by internal divisions. While one faction advocated for all-out war against the Norse intruder, another saw opportunity in alliance. Rollo played these factions masterfully, offering military support to some while threatening others. He became what one chronicler called the sword in every Frankish lord's calculations. When he raided, it was with purpose, weakening his opponents while strengthening those who might support his ambitions. By 911, Rollo had achieved what no Viking leader before him had managed. He had made himself indispensable to the Frankish power structure. King Charles the Simple faced rebellious nobles, external threats, and a collapsing economy. He needed an ally who could secure his northern frontier and restore trade along the Seine. In Rollo, he saw not just a powerful warrior, but a potential solution to decades of Viking invasions. The stage was set for one of history's most remarkable political transformations, the birth of Normandy. The transformation of Rollo, from Viking warlord to Duke of Normandy. The autumn air crackled with tension as two vastly different worlds collided on the banks of the Epte River. On one side stood King Charles the Simple with his Frankish nobles, their gilt-trimmed cloaks and Christian crosses gleaming in the sunlight. On the other, Rollo and his Viking warriors, their weather-beaten faces watching every movement of the Frankish guards. The fate of northern Francia hung in the balance of what happened next. The terms of the treaty were unprecedented. Rollo would receive the land between the Epte and the sea, effectively legitimizing his control over the Seine region. In exchange, he would defend Francia's northern borders and convert to Christianity. But it was the ceremony that followed which entered legend. When told he must kiss the king's foot to seal the agreement, Rollo reportedly growled, "Never shall I bend my knees before any man's knees, nor will I kiss any foot." He ordered one of his warriors to perform the ritual instead. The designated man, rather than kneeling, grabbed the king's foot and lifted it to his mouth, toppling Charles backward, a final Viking jest at Frankish dignity. This moment of political theatre masked a deeper revolution. With a single stroke of parchment, a Viking warlord became a Christian duke, a raider transformed into a legitimate ruler. Rollo's first act as Duke of Normandy revealed his statecraft. He married Gisla, the king's daughter, while keeping his existing wife Poppa as his concubine, skillfully balancing Frankish legitimacy with Viking loyalty. He then surveyed his new realm with the same tactical eye that had once assessed battlefields. The transformation that followed was swift and calculated. Rollo divided his territory among his followers using a modified version of Frankish feudal law, but with distinctly Norse touches. Vikings became nobles overnight, trading their axes for land deeds while maintaining their military obligations. Local Franks who accepted his authority kept their lands and gained protection. Those who resisted simply disappeared from the historical record. A new hybrid culture was being forged, one that would eventually produce the most sophisticated warriors and administrators in medieval Europe. In an age where political legitimacy flowed from the church, Rollo approached his conversion with the same pragmatic efficiency he had once applied to siege warfare. He accepted baptism in Rouen cathedral, taking the Christian name Robert, but maintained enough of his Norse identity to keep his Viking followers loyal. The man who had once destroyed churches now built them, though perhaps with less enthusiasm than he showed for constructing castles and fortifications. The Wolf of the Seine had become a shepherd of sorts, though one whose staff was still made of iron. From raider to ruler, the transformation of Rollo. The newly baptized Duke Robert, though still called Rollo by those who knew him best, faced a challenge greater than any siege or sea battle, transforming a band of raiders into administrators of a legitimate duchy. His first act set the tone for everything that followed. He hung his own men for continuing to raid within his territories, while simultaneously offering amnesty to any Viking who would settle and farm. The message was clear: the old ways were over. Within months, Rollo had implemented a legal system that would become famous throughout Europe for its effectiveness. The clameur de haro, a cry for justice that could halt any action until a court hearing, gave even the poorest peasant a voice. Property rights became sacrosanct. A farmer could leave his plow in the field overnight without fear of theft. The same iron will that had once directed sieges now enforced a peace so complete that chroniclers claimed gold could be left in the fields untouched. His marriage strategy proved equally shrewd. While his union with Princess Gisla remained childless, his relationship with Poppa of Bayeux produced William Longsword, a son who embodied the perfect fusion of Norse strength and Frankish nobility. Rollo raised him to speak both Norse and French, to honor both the old gods and the new Christ, to wield both sword and quill. The boy would become living proof that Viking and Frank could merge into something new, the Norman. The transformation of his warriors into landholders came with a brilliant innovation. Rather than clustering them in military camps, Rollo scattered his veterans throughout the countryside, each responsible for a specific territory. These Norse fighters, now minor lords, married local women and adopted Frankish customs while maintaining their military discipline. Their scattered settlements ensured both military control and cultural assimilation. Within a generation, their children would speak French, pray to Christian saints, and still fight with Viking ferocity. But perhaps Rollo's greatest achievement was economic. He restored the trade routes along the Seine, offering ironclad guarantees of safety to merchants. Cities that had withered under Viking raids bloomed again. The same strategic mind that had once plotted their destruction now planned their expansion. Rouen, his capital, grew from a battered riverside town into a commercial hub where Norse longships and Frankish merchant vessels docked side by side. The wolf had not just settled down to guard the sheep, he had become their most successful shepherd. The emergence of Normandy, Rollo's legacy. By 920, the land that would become known as Normandy pulsed with unprecedented energy. Rollo's hybrid system of governance proved more dynamic than either its Frankish or Norse predecessors. Stone keeps rose where wooden stockades once stood. Churches and monasteries, rebuilt under his protection, became centers of learning rather than targets for plunder. Former raiders now debated Latin texts in newly established scriptoriums, while their children learned to write in French and fight in the distinctive Norman style, a devastating combination of Viking aggression and Frankish horseback warfare. Rollo's administrative genius revealed itself in the details. He ordered a comprehensive land survey, centuries before the famous Domesday Book, establishing clear property rights and tax obligations. His court became known for swift justice, where Viking directness cut through Frankish legal complexity. A new phrase entered the local vernacular, as straight as Rollo's justice, high praise in an age of endemic corruption and favoritism. Agriculture flourished under this new order. Former warriors turned their organizational skills to managing estates, introducing Norse farming techniques to Frankish soil. The result was a surge in productivity that made Normandy one of the wealthiest regions in Francia. Rollo's practical mind showed in his decree that no land should lie fallow, a stark contrast to the widespread abandonment of fields during the Viking Age. The transformation of his military elite proved remarkably successful. Viking jarls became Norman counts, their longships replaced by warhorses, their axes by Norman swords. Yet they retained their Norse talent for adaptation and innovation. Under Rollo's guidance, they developed a new style of castle architecture that combined Roman engineering with Norse defensive concepts. These castles, built first in wood and later in stone, became the nuclei of new towns and administrative centers. By the time his son William Longsword began taking a larger role in governance, Rollo had created something entirely new in medieval Europe. A hybrid society that took the best elements of both Viking and Frankish cultures. The result was a dynamic fusion that would eventually produce the cultural and military force that would reshape medieval Europe. From the ashes of Viking raids had risen a society so successful that within a few generations, other European rulers would send their sons to Normandy to learn the art of governance. A final, ironic triumph for the man who had once been dismissed as a mere pirate. The transformative legacy of Rollo. On a winter's day in 927, the giant who had reshaped European history breathed his last. Rollo died as he had lived, commanding attention even in death. His funeral merged Viking grandeur with Christian ritual, a final demonstration of the cultural fusion he had engineered. As his body was carried through ruined streets, both Norse warriors and Frankish nobles wept openly, a sight unimaginable just decades earlier. The realm he left behind barely resembled the war-torn region he had first invaded. His son, William Longsword, inherited not just a title, but a blueprint for power that would influence medieval governance for centuries. The Norman system Rollo created proved so successful that it would be copied from Sicily to Scotland. His descendants, carrying his political DNA, would display the same remarkable ability to adapt, conquer, and transform the lands they acquired. Within 5 generations, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson William the Conqueror would stand on English soil, claiming a crown and beginning the Norman conquest of England. The Norman troops who followed him carried more than weapons. They brought the governmental and legal innovations first tested in Rollo's duchy. The English common law, which would eventually influence legal systems from America to Australia, owed much to the principles of justice Rollo had established. The architectural legacy proved equally lasting. The castle-building techniques pioneered under his rule evolved into the great stone fortresses that still dot the European landscape. Norman architects would go on to develop their distinctive style of architecture, visible today in buildings from Westminster Abbey to the great cathedrals of Sicily. These stones stand as testament to the organizational genius of a man who had once specialized in destroying such structures. But perhaps Rollo's greatest legacy was the demonstration that adaptation trumps conquest. His success proved that lasting power comes not from strength alone, but from the ability to transform oneself and one's followers to meet new challenges. The Viking who learned to walk when he couldn't ride created a template for cultural fusion that would influence European development for centuries to come. Today, a statue of Rollo still stands in Rouen, depicting not the fierce Viking raider, but the thoughtful ruler who transformed both himself and European history. Rollo, from raider to ruler. Stand today in the heart of Normandy's ancient capital, and you'll find yourself in Rollo's shadow. His bronze likeness towers above Rouen's cathedral square, sword pointed downward in peace, yet his stance still radiating the strength that once made kings tremble. The irony would not be lost on him, the pagan raider now forever cast as the guardian of a Christian cathedral. But then, Rollo's life was built on such ironies. His blood runs through modern European royalty like a hidden tide. Not only did his descendants conquer England, but they went on to rule a vast network of kingdoms. Through William the Conqueror's line, Rollo's DNA passed into nearly every royal house in Europe. The current British royal family, the kings of Spain, and countless noble houses across the continent can trace their lineage back to the giant who once walked because no horse could carry him. Viking tours in modern Norway and Denmark still compete to claim him as their own, while the Rouennais proudly call him their first duke. Few men in history have so thoroughly transcended their origins to become a foundation stone of the very civilization they once sought to plunder. Perhaps that is Rollo's ultimate legacy, not just the kingdoms he built or the bloodline he established, but the lesson his life teaches: that the greatest transformations in history often come not from destroying the old order, but from finding new ways to adapt and rebuild it. The Viking who learned to build rather than burn, to govern rather than plunder, to transform rather than destroy, left behind something far more valuable than plundered gold. He left a template for turning chaos into order that resonates through the centuries, as relevant in our time of rapid change as it was in his own.